Hello, my name is Pamela Zellner. I'm the program manager at the Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, CDHH. Welcome to this interview with our guest today, Maureen. If you could introduce yourself and explain your role as a speech language pathologist. Thank you. Thanks, Pam. So my name is Maureen McEntee. I'm a speech language therapist, and I also interpret for deaf people. I'm a teacher, and I'm a clinical social worker. So I have several different roles. I'm wondering what inspired you to work in the field, speech language, SLP, I'll call it from here on in.
I'm going to voice and let the interpreter voice for me, sign for me. So actually, because I started out in education, I'm a history teacher by training. And I always say, once a history teacher, always a history teacher. I did my student teaching, substituted, et cetera, at the School for the Deaf. And while I was there, I really found that language was just such a key thing. And there is a difference between speech and language. I always say I have parrots, and my parrots have really good speech, but they don't have the good language. They don't understand what it is, that thing they're saying has meaning. And that's that language piece, that cognitive piece. So while I was at the School for the Deaf, I really got interested in language. And that got me to go to get a master's degree in speech and language pathology, really emphasizing on language development, how to enhance language in children and adults.
Okay. So if you could, you said that you have other roles. And I'm wondering what else you do in the field, given those other roles.
So it's funny because it seems like all of my background is in very different areas, but they all connect. So like I said, having worked with deaf kids in education, I really saw the language need. So I got a master's in speech and language. I am a speech and language pathologist. While I was getting my graduate program, I was also working a lot with the deaf community, volunteering in the deaf community. And at that point, went and got certified as an interpreter for the deaf. Did a lot of interpreting in addition to other things, and then saw that there was a real lack of mental health services for deaf people, and went back and got a master's in social work. So they all connect, and I think part of that also is I'm a very grassroots person. So I really believe that as a speech pathologist, as a social worker, as a teacher, I have a role in advocacy and making sure that, especially deaf kids, because they don't always have a voice for themselves, but that the deaf kids get the advocacy they need to get the services they need so that they can reach their full potential.
Wow. It's a lot of roles you have. I'm very impressed. So another question I had, if you could share some of the experiences you have as a speech and language pathologist, and if you could compare that to professions such as interpreting and social work, if you could talk about that.
That's a hard question. So as a speech and language pathologist, and let me talk in general SLP land, I think that we, as a field, often do not understand deaf culture. We do not understand ASL. And yet, if you have a child who is identified as having a hearing loss in Rhode Island, they will be connected somehow with early intervention. Early intervention services will send out a speech pathologist who does not necessarily know that range of services and does not know that range of communication modalities, language modalities that might be out there. I think that's a problem within the field. So for me as a speech pathologist, I can't go into a program, if I know this much little tiny bit out of the whole spectrum and I don't have the whole range, how can I advocate for that child? How can I advocate for that family? So I think I'm going off your question a little bit, but my point is we often have speech pathologists who have a very narrow field. If I know signed English and I don't know ASL, I'm not going out in the field and saying, well, you should use ASL with your deaf child, because I don't know that. I can't give you that service. I think that's one of our ethical dilemmas. So for me, as a speech pathologist, really connects with being a social worker, being the advocacy piece. If I don't know something related to that language piece, I need to make sure that I can do a good referral so that that family can get that information, that child or that adult can get that information. I think that is one of our big problems. In training programs, speech pathologists do not get enough training in language is language. And that's sort of one of those things that comes up, you know, language, ASL, English, they're both languages. It doesn't matter what language. It's language is language. Your brain still handles it the same way, whether it's a visual language or an auditory language. One is not better than the other, you know? One is not worse than the other. And I think there's a lot of professionals, and not just in speech path, but professionals in general, who have a real autist view, so that they discount ASL, they discount the deaf community, they discount deaf people.
Yes, yes, thank you for that answer. So the other question I had, what has been a big challenge for you that you've noticed in adults or children with hearing loss, especially as they face this period we've been in with COVID? How has COVID-19 impacted them? And what in general, are there any tips that you could offer for families who have deaf and hard of hearing children?
That's a great question. I think COVID in general has impacted everyone. If you look at mental health of adults and children, we're seeing a lot more kids who are presenting with anxiety and a lot of other mental health issues because of COVID. So many kids have been isolated. You know, they've got distance learning happening. They don't get that social interaction with their peers. They're not as engaged in education. So they're really suffering. That social emotional development is really suffering for them. The deaf kids who are also doing distance learning, you're looking at some deaf kids who are signing on to Classroom by Google Classroom or by Zoom or some other remote platform, and they don't have that connection. They don't have that interaction. They don't have that face-to-face, which is so essential. So that is definitely, mental health is a huge impact. Same thing with deaf adults and hearing adults. But again, with deaf adults, older deaf adults who don't have technology, some of the elderly who do not have the technology are really much more isolated. You know, a elderly hearing person can pick up a phone and talk to somebody. An elderly deaf person who may be in a nursing home who doesn't have access to an iPad, and we have elderly deaf people in nursing homes who don't have access. They don't have that visual. They don't have that ability to connect. So mental health, big, big, big impact. For communication, even face-to-face or via Zoom, but especially face-to-face, masks. It's been horrific. I'm sure, Pam, you have heard awful stories about people who have gone into the community with a mask trying to communicate who are deaf, and people's ability to interact, their hearing community's ability or willingness to be flexible just isn't there sometimes. So I know that has been a huge challenge. I don't have any particular tips other than be safe, you know, do what we need to do so that we can get out of this COVID environment. And now with some of the restrictions being reduced, hopefully we can actually start meeting face-to-face, even if it's at a social distance. I'll take that. But it's been a challenge. Mental health, mental health, mental health, access to mental health. If you see what's happening, there were high school students yesterday in Providence who left their high school to protest the fact that they want more counselors in school. That's a real sign of what's happening in the larger community. Schools for the deaf kids are no different. They need access to mental health services, And again, how many kids do we know? And I'm talking kids like, you know, preschool through high school through college, who are deaf, who go home and they don't have access to communication with their families. And again, how do you learn those social emotional skills? How do you learn language? How do you learn how to become a capable adult if you don't have that interaction and that access? Access is key.
Yes, yes. And this time of year, the weather starts to be getting nicer, it's warmer. People are getting in groups together outside. Yes, if you can say socially distance, it's more safe, but so many people have lost a lot of time. And I'm glad that the weather is better and we have more opportunities for social contact in a safe way. Yes. So is there any other information or resources that you could think about suggesting with your clients or with families of deaf and hard of hearing children?
So it really depends on the age. I mean, I always say the School for the Deaf is a great resource, you know, again, through preschool all the way up. RIPIN, which is the Rhode Island Parent Information Network, is a really good resource. The Rhode Island Association of the Deaf is a great resource. Perspectives is there. It's another great resource. RIRID, they're all great resources. Again, it's trying to get the word out about all of them and having people realize that. And again, when I say that, I'm thinking more of hearing parents with deaf children, that unless they're connected with some piece of that community, they don't know that. They don't know those resources that are there. And I think, again, as a speech language pathologist, it's my responsibility if I'm working with a family to say, here are the resources. And not just to give it once and say, okay, you're on your own, but to bring it up every so often. Because most families, especially with little kids, are going to be so overwhelmed by the amount of information they get that first couple of weeks, that first couple of months, that they're not going to remember 90% of it. So they just kind of need that periodic check-in of, what do you need? How are you doing? So I think if we work cooperatively, and again, with the Commission on the Deaf, you guys are a great resource as well. So as long as we have those networks that are available, accessible, and open to having communication, even with people who don't have the same views we have, you know, even with people who don't believe in the same communication styles that we believe in. But if we keep that access and willingness to communicate open, that's the best thing we can do for families, with kids, with adults, with the elderly, with the whole range of life of people.
Yes. So I have a few last questions. At the state level, what would you like to see a state commission, such as the Rhode Island State Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, work to do to improve the relationship between speech and language pathologists and patients, families, deaf children, hard of hearing children out in the community?
Another great question. So I think the commission has historically been really good about trying to pull together different groups. I think that having, again, communication happening, we have several groups in Rhode Island that are kind of split off from the rest of the community. And I think it's time to pull everybody back in and say, we can work together. We can agree to disagree. We can agree that we don't believe in the same things. But if our goal is to help deaf kids, and I'm really focusing on deaf kids, but if our goal is to help deaf kids, we need to work together. So I think the commission can really help with that, to pull those different groups and organizations in. I know we've had forums in the past, but maybe this is a good time again. I was just actually sent something about Lead K. And I know that Lead K was very controversial. Speech and language pathologists, my national organization, wrote letters saying, no, it's a terrible thing. But I think there's room for compromise in that. And again, the goal is we want deaf kids to have the same language access and the same language capacity and ability as their hearing peers. So I think the commission can really help with pulling in different groups and organizations, getting us to work together and having that kind of neutral location.
Very good. Thank you. So before we start wrapping up, is there anything that you, as a professional, as a role model, would like to share with deaf and hard of hearing community members or the new generation of youth about speech and language pathology?
So I'd love to tell wannabe speech language pathologists, know what it is you're talking about. Don't always believe what you hear in classes about small d deaf or large d deaf. Be willing to be involved in the community, listen to deaf adults, because the experience of deaf adults is real. What happens in a textbook is not necessarily real. I think that's one key thing. Realize that ASL is a language that's the same as English, the same as any spoken language. It's not any less than. Realize that exposing a child to ASL is not going to impact their English language development. In fact, it's going to help it because you've got a language foundation. For deaf kids, see, I'm old enough now that I remember when deaf kids didn't sign in class, but they'd sign in the bathroom because they were in an oral program, right? I remember hearing stories from some of my friends who were telling me that, you know, they learned that sign was not really a language. You know, it was not recognized as a language like ASL is. So to deaf kids and high schoolers and adults, be proud of your language. Be proud of ASL. ASL has survived, and ASL hopefully will always survive. Use it.
It's so great talking with you. This has been great. I want to thank you very much for your time. And I wanted to thank the people viewing us today. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Pam.